Jason Harrison couldn't remember the last time he'd felt alive. The boardrooms, the endless meetings, the power lunches, everything about his life had become a blur of calculated moves and polished smiles. He was a man who had everything and yet, nothing at all. Or so he thought, until the day everything changed. Jason had always prided himself on being a master of business. He had built his company from the ground up, turning it into one of the most successful tech firms in the country. But with all the money and accolades, something had been missing. The people who worked for him, his employees, were just numbers on a spreadsheet, statistics that were easily replaced when the next person came along. He'd stopped looking beyond his own world, his own glass tower, and that had cost him dearly. Lately, he'd been haunted by the thought, what if I lost everything? What if I was just another struggling soul, fighting to make ends meet? It was a thought that gnawed at him, day and night. That's when the idea struck. He'd seen enough. He'd been living in a bubble, surrounded by the luxury of wealth, but he had no real understanding of the struggles that everyday people faced. It was time to experience it firsthand. That's why Jason Harrison had decided to go undercover. Today, he would leave the boardroom behind and step into the world of ordinary Americans. He would become someone else, someone whose name didn't carry weight. He would work at a local diner as a dishwasher. It was a small job, sure, but it was one that could teach him what he had been missing all these years. Jason parked his sleek black car in the empty lot behind the diner. He stared at the modest building, feeling a flutter of nervousness in his chest. This was real. There would be no fancy suits, no personal assistants, and definitely no million-dollar deals. For the next few weeks, he would be Jason, the dishwasher, just another face in the crowd. Walking through the back door, Jason was hit with the smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee. It was a smell that seemed so simple, yet it carried with it the weight of decades of hard work and dedication. The kitchen was a flurry of activity, cooks barking orders, the sizzle of frying eggs, and the clatter of dishes. But in the chaos, Jason could sense something more. Something deeper. In the corner of the kitchen stood a young woman, hunched over the counter, her shoulders trembling. Her dark brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her apron was covered in splatters of grease and sauce. She was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, clearly trying to hide her tears. Jason froze. There was something about the way she held herself, the way she tried to be invisible, that caught his attention. He couldn't explain it, but he felt an instant connection. For all the wealth he had amassed, for all the power he wielded in his business world, he had never seen someone so vulnerable. Her name, he would soon learn, was Ella. She glanced up as Jason approached, her face quickly changing from sadness to a forced smile. "You must be the new dishwasher," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Welcome aboard." Jason nodded, unsure of what to say. He had been trained to speak in boardrooms, not kitchens. "Yeah, I'm Jason. Nice to meet you." Her smile faltered, and she turned back to the stove, as if her mind was elsewhere. Jason could see she wasn't the type to open up easily. Yet, something in her eyes made him want to know more. He wanted to ask her what was wrong, to offer some kind of comfort, but he knew that would cross a line. She wasn't here to make friends, and neither was he. The morning passed in a blur of dishwashing and scraping food off plates, the steam from the sinks making his shirt cling to his skin. But Jason couldn't shake the image of Ella from his mind. There was something about her that seemed out of place in this chaotic environment. Her eyes were full of pain, though she hid it well behind a mask of professionalism. He watched as she moved through the diner, taking orders, delivering food, always quick and efficient. But every so often, Jason would catch a glimpse of her wiping her eyes, trying to hide the tears that seemed to always be just beneath the surface. At one point, when the diner was nearly empty, Jason mustered the courage to speak to her. "Hey, is everything okay?" Ella looked at him, clearly caught off guard by the question. She hesitated before offering a half-hearted smile. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, though her voice was far from convincing. "Just a long day, that's all." Jason wasn't buying it. He had seen too much of the world to not recognize when someone was struggling. But he didn't press her. Instead, he simply nodded and went back to washing dishes, his mind swirling with thoughts of Ella's hidden pain. As the day wore on, Jason's thoughts continued to linger on her. He couldn't help but wonder what her story was. Why was she working in this diner, clearly going through something, when she seemed so much more than the job she was doing? There was an undeniable pull in him, an instinct to help her, but he wasn't sure how. He had lived his life surrounded by wealth and influence, but this world, was different. Ella was different. Later that evening, as the diner began to wind down and the staff started cleaning up, Jason found himself still thinking about her. Ella was sitting at the counter, staring blankly at the empty plates in front of her. It wasn't just exhaustion that showed on her face, it was something deeper, something Jason couldn't quite place. It was then that he realized, maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about understanding the struggles of ordinary people. This was about understanding people, about connecting on a deeper level, not as a businessman and an employee, but as two individuals with their own stories, their own struggles. And for the first time in a long time, Jason Harrison didn't feel so alone. Before he left that night, he made a silent promise to himself: he would find out what was really going on with Ella. But for now, the first step was simple: he would be there for her, even if it was just as a quiet presence in the background. And with that, Jason walked out of the diner, his mind racing, his heart stirred by a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Something told him that his journey had just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next day, Jason returned to the diner with a newfound sense of purpose. As he walked through the back door, the familiar scent of grease and coffee enveloped him, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Ella, the way she had seemed so distant, her smile forced, her eyes always a little too empty. It was a puzzle, and Jason was determined to solve it. Ella was already at the counter when he arrived, wiping down the surfaces with a cloth. She looked up as he walked in and offered him a brief nod, but this time, there was a softness to her gaze, a quiet acknowledgement that hadn't been there the day before. He could tell she wasn't the type of person to let anyone in easily, but there was something in the way she carried herself that made Jason want to learn more about her. "Morning," he said, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Morning," Ella replied, not meeting his eyes. "You're early today." Jason chuckled softly, the sound unfamiliar to him. "Yeah, I figured I'd get a head start. A lot of dishes to wash, right?" Ella gave a faint smile, but Jason could tell it wasn't the smile of someone who was truly happy. It was the kind of smile that hid pain, the kind of smile that tried to convince others, and perhaps herself, that everything was fine when it wasn't. He didn't press her for more, but as the hours passed, Jason couldn't help but notice the little things. Every now and then, Ella would pause and look off into space, as if her mind were a million miles away. Sometimes, she would bite her lip, a nervous habit that seemed to speak volumes about her inner turmoil. The more Jason observed her, the more he realized that there was far more to her story than he could ever guess. By the time the lunch rush hit, Jason had learned that Ella had been working at the diner for nearly 3 years. It wasn't her dream job, far from it. She had always wanted to be a teacher, to inspire young minds and make a difference in the world. But life hadn't worked out that way. Her mother had fallen ill several years ago, and Ella had been forced to drop out of college to take care of her. Her younger brother, Daniel, was still in high school, and she was the one who supported them both. The burden of caring for her family had left her little room for anything else. Dreams, it seemed, were luxuries she couldn't afford. As the day wore on, Jason continued to observe Ella in silence. It was clear she was carrying a heavy load, both physically and emotionally. Her shoulders were always tense, and every so often, she would rub her temples as if trying to alleviate the constant headache that seemed to be a permanent companion. During a brief break, Jason approached her again. This time, he was more determined to get her to open up. He'd never been good at talking to people on a personal level, especially those from a completely different walk of life, but there was something about Ella that made him want to try. "Hey," he started, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything really okay? You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I just get the sense that you're carrying a lot." Ella's eyes flickered to him, and for a moment, she looked as though she might say something. But instead, she just shrugged, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's nothing, really. Just the usual stuff. Bills, responsibilities. You know how it is." Jason didn't push further. He could tell she wasn't ready to talk, and that was fine. But deep down, he knew there was more to her story. He couldn't help but feel that the walls she had built around herself were far more complex than she was letting on. Over the next few days, Jason continued his routine at the diner, working alongside Ella and the rest of the staff. He observed her interactions with the customers, how she was always so patient, always smiling, even when it was clear she was exhausted. She worked 2 jobs to keep her family afloat, this diner during the day and a night shift at a local convenience store. The grind never stopped, and Jason began to wonder how she managed to keep going, day after day, with so little to show for it. One evening, as they closed up the diner, Jason found himself alone with Ella again. The other staff members had already left, and the quiet hum of the kitchen filled the air. Jason was wiping down the counter when Ella walked in, her face pale and drawn from a long shift. "Do you want some coffee?" Jason asked, breaking the silence. Ella shook her head, her voice low. "No, thanks. I'm just trying to get through tonight." Jason could hear the weariness in her tone, the exhaustion that seemed to seep into every word she spoke. He couldn't help but ask, "Is it always this hard?" Ella paused, and for the first time since he'd met her, she seemed to truly think about her answer. "It's been harder recently. My mom, she's not doing well. I'm trying to get her into a better treatment program, but it's expensive. And with the bills piling up, I don't know how much longer I can keep up." Jason's heart tightened. He knew that feeling, the weight of responsibility, the pressure of not being able to provide everything your family needed. He had never experienced it himself, but he had seen it in the eyes of others, in people who worked long hours and struggled to make ends meet. "I'm sorry," he said softly, not knowing what else to say. Ella gave a small, grateful smile. "It's okay. I'm used to it. I just wish things were different. I wish I could do more, you know." Jason nodded, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't solve all of Ella's problems, but for the first time in a long while, he felt compelled to do something, anything, to help. There had to be a way. As Ella wiped down the counter, her movements slow and deliberate, Jason realized just how much her story mirrored the struggles he'd been disconnected from for so long. The weight of responsibility. The sacrifices. The dreams put on hold. He stood there for a moment, watching her in the dim light of the diner, and something clicked inside of him. This wasn't just about his project anymore. It wasn't just about understanding the struggles of people like Ella. It was about finding a way to make things better, for her and for himself. But how could he, a man who had spent his life building empires, offer help in a world so far removed from his own? Jason wasn't sure, but he was determined to find out. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. The next few days were a blur for Jason. The hours at the diner were long and grueling, and yet, as he worked beside Ella, he found himself more and more invested in her story. Every dish he washed, every table he cleared, felt like a step deeper into her world, a world he had never truly understood before. His life had always been one of luxury and ease, but as he moved through the motions of this new life, he could feel the weight of it, the pressure, the struggle, the constant push to survive. It wasn't just about Ella anymore. It was about the world around her, the world that Jason had ignored for so long. And with each passing day, it became clear to him that he couldn't stay in his comfortable bubble much longer. He had to do something. But what? The thought of offering money crossed his mind more than once, but he quickly pushed it aside. Money wouldn't fix the deeper issues Ella was facing. It wouldn't ease the stress she carried every day or take away the pain of watching her mother suffer. Money was a temporary solution, a band-aid on a wound that needed more than just a superficial fix. It was a Tuesday afternoon when things started to shift. Jason was in the back of the diner, scrubbing the sink when Ella walked in, her eyes red from what seemed like hours of crying. The moment she saw him, she quickly wiped her eyes, but Jason could tell something was off. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Ella forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just a little tired. Long day." Jason didn't buy it. He had seen this before, the forced smiles, the mask people put on to hide their pain. But this time, he wasn't going to let her push him away. "Come on, Ella," he said softly. "You don't have to pretend. If something's wrong, you can talk about it." For a moment, Ella just stared at him, her lips trembling as if she were holding something back. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "It's my mom," she said, her voice breaking. "She's getting worse. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. They've given up on her, Jason. And I don't know how to handle it." Jason's heart sank. He had known it was bad, but hearing it from her, hearing the pain in her voice, it hit him harder than he expected. He had seen his own family struggle with loss, with illness, but never like this. Never with the desperation that Ella felt every single day. "I'm so sorry, Ella," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't even imagine what you're going through." Ella looked down, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back the tears. "I don't know what to do anymore. I can't afford to put her in a better program, and I can't keep working these 2 jobs forever. I'm running on empty, and I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Jason could see the weight of it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the helplessness, the fear of losing everything she had been fighting for. And in that moment, Jason realized just how deep her pain went, how much of it she carried every day, hidden behind the apron and the smile she gave to customers. The realization hit him hard. Ella wasn't just struggling financially. She was carrying the weight of a broken system, one that didn't provide enough support for people like her, people who worked tirelessly but still couldn't catch a break. Jason wanted to help her. He wanted to fix everything, to make it better. But how? He wasn't sure what he could do. His wealth, his connections, none of that could solve the problem in front of him. Ella needed something deeper, something more than just money or charity. She needed hope. But what could he offer her? What was there that could truly make a difference? The answer, as simple as it was, began to take shape in his mind. It wasn't about money or grand gestures. It was about understanding, about showing her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Jason realized that he could help in a way that didn't require handing over a check. He could be her ally, her support in a world that had ignored her for so long. And so, as the diner quieted down and the last customers left, Jason made a promise to himself: he would find a way to make Ella's life easier. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to figure it out. But first, he needed to understand more about her. He needed to know what she was up against, beyond what she had told him. And so, the next day, he found himself asking questions that, at first, Ella seemed reluctant to answer. "You said your mom's illness has been getting worse," Jason said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Can you tell me more about what's going on? I mean, I know it's personal, but I want to understand. I want to help, if I can. Ella hesitated, glancing away as if trying to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. It's cancer, she said quietly. It started a few years ago, and she went through chemo. But it's come back. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do. I don't have the money to put her in a better program, and even if I did, I don't know if it would make a difference. I don't know how to make it stop. How to fix it. Jason felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to her. He had heard the statistics, the stories of families losing everything to medical bills. But hearing it from Ella, someone he had come to care about, was a different story. It was real. It was personal. And it hurt. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wish I could do more. Ella just nodded, wiping her eyes. I know. I know you're trying. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this. I feel like I'm drowning. Jason didn't know what to say. All he could do was stand there and listen, offering what little comfort he could with his presence. The hours passed, and Jason's mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about Ella's words, about the hopelessness she felt. He wanted to make things better for her, but he had no idea how. All he knew was that something had to change. But how could he help someone who had already been through so much? What could he do to make a real difference in her life? The rising conflict wasn't just about the external pressures Ella faced, it was about Jason's own internal battle. Could he, a man of privilege and power, truly change the life of someone like Ella, who had been pushed to the edge of her limits? As the night wore on, Jason found himself wondering if he was in over his head. But one thing was certain, he couldn't turn back now. He had to find a way to be there for Ella, even if he didn't have all the answers yet. Jason's thoughts were a tangled mess as he left the diner that night. He had learned so much about Ella, about the relentless struggle she faced every day, but there was still so much he didn't know. What more could he do for her? How could he make a real difference in a world so deeply flawed, so relentlessly unfair? The next few days passed in a blur of work, reflection, and attempts to push his questions aside. But Ella's situation lingered in the back of his mind, as constant as a drumbeat. Every time he saw her, every time he heard her voice, something inside of him stirred, a need to help, to fix, to make it better for her. But as much as he wanted to act, there was one thing that held him back, the fear of not being enough. He had the resources, the connections, and the ability to make waves in the world, but how could those things change the core of Ella's problems? How could they erase the pain she carried in her eyes, the weight on her shoulders? As much as Jason tried to ignore it, he couldn't escape the reality that the answers weren't simple. There was no quick fix to what Ella was facing, no check he could write, no magic solution he could offer. This wasn't about money, power, or influence. It was about something far deeper, something that went beyond what he had ever imagined in his life. The moment of clarity came on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, when Jason found himself once again sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee as he watched Ella move through the diner with her usual grace, even though her exhaustion was evident in every step she took. It was clear she had given up on sleep in favor of working, of continuing the endless cycle of responsibility and survival. Jason didn't know why he did it, but the question slipped out before he could stop it. Why don't you let someone help you, Ella? I mean, I see you struggling. I see how much you're carrying. Why do you keep doing this all alone? Ella froze for a split second, her back to him as she wiped down the counter. For the briefest of moments, Jason saw her shoulders tense up, as if bracing for something painful. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost too soft to hear. I don't know how to stop, she said, her words laced with both frustration and sadness. I've been doing it for so long. It's just easier, I guess. I don't want to burden anyone. I don't want to look weak. Jason could see the walls she had built around herself, the years of struggle and self-reliance that had made her afraid to ask for help. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Ella wasn't the only one who had learned to hide behind a mask. He had done it too. The difference was, his mask had been made of privilege, while hers was made of survival. "Sometimes," Jason said, his voice steady, "you don't have to do it alone. It's okay to lean on people, you know. To let someone else carry some of the weight." Ella glanced at him over her shoulder, a mixture of skepticism and something else, something softer, flickering in her eyes. But then she turned away again, as if the thought of letting someone else help was too foreign for her to accept. "I can't afford that," she said quietly. "And even if I could, I don't think it would change anything. The world doesn't care about people like me." Jason's heart sank. He had heard that sentiment before, in the voices of others who had been crushed by the weight of society's indifference. But hearing it from Ella, the woman who had been kind and strong, even when it seemed like the world was stacked against her, was a sobering wake-up call. The world did care about people like Ella, he thought. The problem was, it didn't care enough. Not enough to make real, lasting change. And the more Jason thought about it, the more he realized that he was part of that system. He had been blind to it all along. "I don't believe that," Jason said firmly. "I think the world can care, if we let it. And if we do something about it." Ella glanced at him again, this time with a mixture of confusion and caution in her gaze. "And what exactly are you planning to do? The world doesn't change overnight. It's not that easy." "No, it's not easy," Jason admitted, "but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Sometimes, the smallest change can start a ripple effect, and you never know how far that ripple can go." He could see Ella wrestling with his words. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part of her was afraid of false hope, afraid of more disappointment. Jason knew the feeling all too well. He had spent years building his own empire, watching the world bend to his will, yet he had never truly tried to help someone like Ella, someone who didn't have the same opportunities, the same privileges, the same safety nets. Jason leaned forward, his tone earnest. "I want to help, Ella. I want to find a way to ease some of your burden. But I need you to trust me. I need you to let me in." She looked at him, her face unreadable for a moment, before she finally sighed, wiping her hands on the dish towel. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," she said quietly. "I've been on my own for so long, Jason. I don't know how to ask for help. And I don't know if I'm ready to." Jason nodded, understanding more than she realized. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Breaking down the walls she had spent years building wasn't going to happen overnight. But if he could find a way in, if he could show her that asking for help didn't make her weak, that it made her human, then maybe, just maybe, they could figure something out. For the first time since he'd met her, Jason felt a sense of clarity. It wasn't just about money, or resources, or even influence. It was about giving Ella the emotional space to be vulnerable, to let someone else take on some of her weight. It was about showing her that there was another way to live, one that didn't involve carrying everything alone. And so, as the days wore on, Jason decided to take a step back and reassess. He couldn't solve all of Ella's problems at once, but he could start by being there for her, by offering the one thing that she needed most, a real connection. But even as Jason tried to navigate this new, uncertain path, he could feel the pressure building. His project, the one that had brought him here in the first place, was still a part of him. He couldn't ignore it forever. The journey ahead would be one of learning, of discovering not just how to help Ella, but how to change the narrative, how to use his privilege to make a real impact. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But Jason was ready for the challenge. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stirring within him, something more than just a desire to succeed. He felt a responsibility to make things better. Not just for him, but for people like Ella. And he was determined to find a way. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change for Jason. What started as an attempt to help Ella, to break down the walls she had carefully constructed around herself, began to evolve into something deeper, something more personal. Jason could feel it, the pull of empathy, the weight of his responsibility to her and to himself. He wasn't just helping someone in need anymore, he was rediscovering what it meant to truly care, to connect with someone on a human level. Ella, however, was still hesitant. Every small act of kindness Jason extended was met with suspicion or withdrawal. She had been burned too many times before, and opening up to someone like him, someone with resources and power, felt too vulnerable. Too risky. But Jason refused to give up. He had seen her at her worst, had witnessed the exhaustion in her eyes and the pain she carried, but he also saw her strength. The quiet way she kept going, despite everything, despite the odds stacked against her. Jason respected that more than anything. One night, after a particularly difficult shift, Ella was sitting in the back, nursing a cup of coffee and staring into the distance. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few late-night regulars, and the usual buzz of chatter had died down. Jason sat across from her, sensing that something was different in the air tonight, something was about to shift. "I've been thinking a lot," Ella began, her voice low and uncertain. "About everything you've said, about the idea of letting someone help. I don't know if I'm ready for it. It feels wrong, like I'd be giving up part of who I am if I did." Jason took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I get it. I do. But you don't have to carry everything on your own, Ella. It's not weakness to let someone in. In fact, it takes a lot of strength to admit when you need help." She looked at him, her expression guarded but curious. "And what happens if I let you in? What happens if I trust you?" Jason paused. The question was heavy, laden with the uncertainty of both their futures. What could he promise? What could he say that would reassure her enough to break down the barriers she had built? "I can't promise everything will be perfect," he said quietly, "but I can promise that I'll always be here. I'll listen, I'll support you, and I'll do whatever I can to help. You don't have to face this alone." Ella's eyes softened, just slightly. For a moment, it seemed like she was considering it. But then, just as quickly as it appeared, the wall was back, and she shook her head. "I don't know if I can trust that," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I've trusted people before, and they've let me down. My mom's been let down by doctors, by social workers, by people who promised they'd help. In the end, it's always just me." Jason's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. He wanted to do something, anything, that could ease that hurt, that could prove to her that not everyone would let her down. "It's not just about the doctors or the people who've failed you," Jason said, leaning forward. "It's about you. You're the one who's been fighting all this time. And no matter what, you deserve more than this, Ella. You deserve to have someone who's in your corner. You deserve to feel supported, to not have to go through everything alone." Ella's eyes began to water, and for a moment, Jason thought she might cry. But instead, she took a deep breath and wiped her eyes, as if she were trying to regain control. "I don't know what to do with all this, Jason," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm scared. I'm scared of trusting you, of trusting anyone again. What if you leave? What if this is just some kind of distraction for you? A project to feel good about yourself?" Jason didn't hesitate. He knew this moment was pivotal, not just for her, but for him as well. This was the moment when everything would either fall apart or come together. "I'm not going anywhere, Ella," he said firmly. "I didn't come here to feel good about myself. I came here because I saw you, and I realized that I don't want to walk away from this. From you. I care about you, and I'm here for the long haul. This isn't a project. This is real." The words hung in the air between them, charged with an emotion neither of them had fully allowed themselves to feel before. Jason knew it was a risk, opening himself up to someone who had been hurt so many times, but he was past the point of caring. He couldn't walk away from her now. Not when she needed someone the most. Ella didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, staring at him, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of her cup. And Jason waited. He didn't push. He didn't say anything more. He simply allowed the silence to speak for itself. Finally, Ella spoke again, her voice quieter this time, but there was a shift in it, a softness, a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. "I don't know how to let people in, Jason," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "But maybe I can try. Maybe I can trust you, just this once." Jason felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to her words. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the beginning of something new, something that neither of them had anticipated, but something that was exactly what they both needed. "I'll never force you, Ella," Jason said gently. "But I'll be here, no matter what. We can take it one step at a time." The tension in the room seemed to lift just a little, as if a small weight had been lifted off Ella's shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe, to relax, even if only a little. And in that moment, Jason realized that this wasn't just about helping Ella, it was about his own growth, his own journey. He had come into her world thinking he could fix everything, but what he was discovering was that he couldn't fix her problems. He could only be there for her, as a friend, as a partner in this fight. The emotional climax of their relationship had arrived, not in a grand gesture, not in a dramatic revelation, but in the simple, quiet admission of trust. It was a turning point for both of them, a moment that would forever change the course of their lives. For the first time, Jason felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And as he looked at Ella, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. But what came next was a challenge neither of them could have anticipated. The world outside had already begun to notice their connection, and soon, their lives would be pulled in directions neither of them could have predicted. And in that, the real test of their strength was only just beginning. Ella had let her guard down, just a little. The raw emotion she had shown Jason felt like a small breakthrough in a world that had often seemed to expect her to stay strong, to stay untouchable. She had allowed herself to trust him for the first time in years, and it wasn't just a simple act of opening up. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling of the walls she had spent a lifetime building to protect herself. But even with this newfound vulnerability, Jason knew they were only at the start of what would be a long, difficult journey. Ella's trust wasn't something that could be easily won, and the path ahead wouldn't be without setbacks. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening between them. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the city, Jason found himself sitting at his desk in his apartment, staring at his laptop but unable to concentrate. His thoughts kept drifting back to Ella, the way her smile had softened the night before, the way her eyes had finally looked at him without the usual walls. She had let him in, but now, Jason was beginning to realize just how much of a responsibility that was. He had never really allowed himself to feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Sure, he had built an empire, had seen countless people come and go, but none of it had ever truly challenged him in the way that this had. Helping Ella was no longer a side project, a way to kill time while he worked on his bigger plans. This was real. And for the first time, Jason felt as though he had someone, he couldn't walk away from. But there was something else, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of their interactions, something Jason hadn't quite been able to identify until now. A shift in the air. A quiet tension that he had ignored up until that point. It was as though something was coming, something he couldn't control, something that would force them both to confront the reality of their situation. As he was lost in thought, his phone rang, snapping him out of his trance. It was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated for a moment but answered it anyway. "Hello? Jason?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but there was something urgent in it. "This is Sarah, from the city's nonprofit board. We need to talk." Jason straightened up in his chair, his mind racing. He had worked with various non-profits in the past, but this was the first time he had received a call like this. Sarah? What's going on? We've been looking into the diner where you've been spending time, Sarah continued, her tone low and serious. It's run by a woman named Ella Matthews, right? Jason's heart skipped a beat. What's this about? Jason, listen carefully, Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. We've received reports about the diner, and there are some things going on that you might not be aware of. There are people involved, dangerous people, and we think they're using the diner as a front for something illegal. Ella might be in danger, and we need to talk to her before it's too late. The words hit Jason like a ton of bricks. He felt the weight of them pressing down on him, suffocating him. Ella had been so open with him, so vulnerable, and now he was learning that there was a darker side to her world that he had no idea existed. Dangerous people. Illegal activities. This wasn't what he had signed up for. This wasn't the kind of trouble he had imagined when he first decided to help her. The thought of Ella, the woman he had come to care about, caught up in something dangerous was more than unsettling, it was terrifying. Are you sure about this? Jason asked, his voice shaky. Are you certain that Ella is involved in all of this? We're not sure yet, but there are too many red flags to ignore, Sarah said. We need to meet with her, Jason. And we need to move quickly. Jason's mind raced. He knew he couldn't just walk away from this, couldn't just turn his back on Ella now that he had become so deeply entangled in her life. But what could he do? He was a businessman, not a detective. He wasn't equipped to deal with something this complicated, this dangerous. But there was one thing he did know, he couldn't let Ella face this on her own. Not after everything she had already been through. I'll be there, Jason said, determination creeping into his voice. Where do we meet? The next few hours passed in a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. Jason arranged to meet Sarah at a small, discreet cafe on the outskirts of town. When he arrived, he was immediately struck by the gravity of the situation. Sarah wasn't alone, there were two other people with her, one a tall, sharp-eyed man in his 40s, and the other a woman in her 30s with a no-nonsense air about her. They looked like people who had seen things, people who had lived in the shadows for too long. Jason took a seat at the table, his mind still whirling with questions. He had never been involved in anything like this before, and yet here he was, sitting across from people who clearly had experience with danger. Let's get straight to the point, Jason, Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. We've been monitoring the diner for weeks now. There are people coming and going who don't belong. People who are connected to a larger, more dangerous operation. Ella's diner, as it turns out, might be right in the middle of it all. Jason's stomach churned. What are you saying? Are you telling me that she's running a criminal operation? No, the man beside Sarah spoke up, his tone matter of fact. She's not involved in the crime, at least not knowingly. But she's caught in the crossfire. She's working for someone who has deep ties to organized crime. We think she's in over her head, and we need to get to her before they do. Jason leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. Ella wasn't just struggling with the pressures of running a diner, taking care of her family, and surviving. No, now it seemed that her problems were much darker, more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. How do you know all this? Jason asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. We've been tracking a few leads, the woman at the table spoke now, her voice steady. Ella's diner has been on our radar for a while. We've traced some of the people who frequent the place back to a larger network. We don't know how deep she's involved, but we need to find out. And we need to do it quickly. Jason's pulse quickened as the magnitude of the situation became clearer. Ella was in trouble, deep trouble, and Jason was in no way prepared for the kind of storm that was about to hit. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Where is she now? Jason asked, standing up, determination flooding his veins. "We don't know," Sarah replied. "But we think she's still at the diner. We need to get to her, Jason, before it's too late." With that, the turning point of Jason's journey had arrived. Everything he thought he knew about Ella, about his own mission to help her, had been upended. Now, it wasn't just about changing her life, it was about saving it. And no matter the cost, Jason was ready to do whatever it took. Jason's mind raced as he left the cafe. The weight of Sarah's words, Ella's potential involvement with dangerous people, the looming threat of crime, the looming shadow of danger, clung to him, each new detail deepening the pit of anxiety in his stomach. What had he gotten himself into? What was Ella mixed up in, and more importantly, how could he save her from it? He was no longer just Jason, the undercover millionaire helping a struggling waitress. He was something more. He was her lifeline, the only one who could potentially pull her out of this mess. And as much as the thought terrified him, he knew there was no turning back. As he drove toward the diner, his mind went over everything he knew about Ella. She wasn't the type to get involved in anything shady. She was kind-hearted, scrappy, and more than capable of surviving on her own, but she'd been dealt a tough hand in life. It was clear that whoever was behind the operations at the diner hadn't just picked a random target. They'd chosen her because of her vulnerabilities, her need for something stable and secure. They'd manipulated that. Jason gripped the steering wheel tightly as the diner came into view. The neon sign outside flickered, casting an eerie glow over the quiet street. For a moment, he hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The diner had always been a place of comfort for him, where he found Ella's resilience, her strength in the midst of struggle. But now, he knew it was more than just a diner. It was a battleground. And the stakes were higher than ever. He parked his car across the street, out of sight, and walked toward the diner. The front door was propped open, and through the glass, he could see Ella at the counter, wiping down the counter with a rag, her movements slow and tired. The usual bustle of the diner was absent, no rush of customers, no chatter from the late-night crowd. It felt strangely empty, as if the calm before a storm had settled in. Jason pushed open the door, the familiar chime of the bell above it echoing in the silence. Ella glanced up, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Jason? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tentative, her posture stiff. "I needed to talk to you," Jason said, his voice urgent. He closed the door behind him, walking toward her with deliberate steps. "It's important. We need to go somewhere, now." Ella frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "What's going on? Why are you acting like this?" Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Ella, listen to me. You're in danger. There are people, dangerous people, who've been using this diner for something illegal. You're caught in the middle of it, and we need to get you out of here before it gets worse." Ella blinked, as though she couldn't quite process the words he was saying. "What? No, that's not possible. This is my job. I've been here for years. I'm not mixed up in anything like that, Jason. You're mistaken." "I wish I were," Jason said, his tone heavy with concern. "But I'm not. There's a bigger operation here, Ella, and you're in the middle of it whether you know it or not. People like you, people who are struggling and just trying to get by, are the ones they prey on." Ella looked at him, her eyes filled with disbelief, her lips trembling as she tried to make sense of the words. "How do you know all this? Who are these people?" Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There are people behind this, people I've been tracking for a while. They've been using the diner as a front for their operations. And they've got their sights set on you now. They're not going to stop until they get what they want. But you don't have to face this alone. I'm here to help you." Ella shook her head, her hand gripping the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I don't understand. This can't be happening. I've been trying so hard, Jason. This diner is all I have left. If I walk away from this, I lose everything. Jason's heart went out to her. He could hear the desperation in her voice, the fear she was trying to hide. I know. I know it's hard. But your life, your safety, matters more than this place. You don't have to do this anymore. We'll find a way out. You don't have to be a part of this world. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes darted to the back of the diner, where the kitchen door swung slightly open. Jason could feel the weight of her indecision pressing down on her, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the people behind the operation would make their move. You don't understand, she said finally, her voice breaking. I can't just walk away. I have bills. I have my mom to take care of. This job, it's the only thing keeping us afloat. What else am I supposed to do? Jason reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder gently. I get it, Ella. I really do. But you don't have to carry all this on your own anymore. I'm not asking you to quit everything. I'm asking you to trust me. Trust me when I say that you're worth more than this mess. And I'm not going to let them hurt you. Ella's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. She was so tired, so beaten down by the weight of the world on her shoulders, and Jason could see that she was barely holding it together. He had to make her believe him, had to make her see that there was another way out of this. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, a loud crash echoed from the back of the diner. Jason's head snapped toward the sound. His heart skipped a beat when he saw a figure emerge from the kitchen, a tall, intimidating man with a cold expression and a gun in his hand. Jason. I think it's time you leave, the man said, his voice low and threatening. Jason's body went rigid. He stepped in front of Ella instinctively, his protective instincts kicking in. The situation had just escalated. It was no longer just about saving Ella from her troubled past, it was about survival. Get out of here, now, the man ordered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jason's pulse raced. He didn't have much time. His mind worked quickly, calculating his next move. Ella, he said, his voice sharp but calm. You need to go. Now. Trust me. With a quick glance at Jason, Ella hesitated for just a moment before she bolted toward the back door of the diner. Jason followed, staying close behind, knowing that the real danger was just beginning. What had started as a simple attempt to help Ella had now turned into something much bigger, a fight for their lives. And there was no turning back now. Ella's breath came in shallow gasps as she sprinted toward the back door of the diner, Jason hot on her heels. The man with the gun was following them, his footsteps heavy and determined. Jason knew they didn't have much time. His heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he mentally plotted their escape. Every instinct in him screamed to protect Ella, to get her out of there, away from the chaos that was closing in on them. The back alley behind the diner was narrow and littered with old boxes and trash bins, but it offered a brief moment of cover. They reached the door just as the man's voice echoed from inside the diner. You think you can run? The man called. You're not getting away. Not now. Jason's pulse spiked. There was no time to waste. The alley was their only chance to get ahead, and it was clear they couldn't afford to stop. Keep running, Jason urged, his voice firm as he grabbed Ella's hand. Don't stop, no matter what. We can't let him catch up. Ella nodded, her face pale with fear, but she didn't hesitate. She ran alongside him, her feet pounding the ground as they made their way through the alley. Jason's mind was racing. He wasn't sure where they were going, he didn't have a plan, didn't have the luxury of time to think. All he knew was that they had to get far enough away so they could regroup. As they turned the corner of the alley, Jason spotted a car parked on the side of the street. It was his, parked just far enough away to remain unnoticed. The only problem was that it was still a couple of blocks away, and the man chasing them wouldn't be far behind. Stay close, Jason said, pulling Ella toward the car. We're almost there. They ran as fast as they could, but the sounds of footsteps behind them grew louder. The man was gaining on them. Jason glanced over his shoulder, barely able to make out the silhouette of the gunman as he charged forward. They had no time to waste. The car was in sight, but before they could reach it, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the air. Get down! Jason shouted, grabbing Ella and pulling her toward a nearby dumpster. They hit the ground hard, the sound of the bullet piercing the air like a warning shot. Move, move! Jason hissed, dragging Ella behind the dumpster. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest as the reality of the situation set in. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. They were in real danger now, and the stakes were higher than he'd ever anticipated. The man was getting closer. Jason could hear his footsteps, the heavy rhythm of his boots approaching their hiding place. They needed to make a move, and fast. Stay here, Jason whispered to Ella, his voice urgent but calm. I'm going to distract him. When I give the signal, you run for the car. Don't stop. I'll catch up. Ella's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded, trusting him with her life. The weight of the moment hung between them like a silent understanding. She knew what was at stake. Jason couldn't afford to fail her. Taking a deep breath, Jason crept around the side of the dumpster, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. His eyes locked on the man, who was now only a few feet away, his attention focused on the alley ahead of him. It was the perfect moment. Jason took a step forward and then hurled a trash can lid across the alley, creating a loud, distracting noise. The man whirled around, his gun raised, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. It worked. The gunman turned away from Ella's position, giving her the chance to make her move. Run! Jason shouted, his voice sharp. Ella didn't hesitate. She sprang to her feet, her legs moving as if they were on autopilot. Jason watched her for a split second, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows, racing toward safety. He could see the car now, just a few more steps, and she'd be there. The man was still distracted, but he wasn't fooled for long. Jason could see his eyes narrowing, his grip tightening on the gun. The moment of diversion was almost over. Jason moved quickly, darting back toward the dumpster, keeping low to the ground. As he made his way toward the car, he heard the man's voice calling out behind him. Stop running. You're not going anywhere. The chase wasn't over. But Jason was determined, he wouldn't let the man take them down now. Not when Ella was so close to safety. As Jason reached the car, he saw Ella already inside, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. The engine was running, the headlights casting a soft glow on the street, illuminating the darkness around them. Jason dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. Go, he barked, his voice tense. Ella didn't hesitate. She slammed her foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car tore down the street. Jason glanced over his shoulder, watching the diner fade into the distance, the gunman now nowhere in sight. They had made it out. For now. But Jason knew that this was only the beginning. As the car sped through the quiet streets, Ella's hands were still trembling on the wheel, but her voice was steady. What's happening, Jason? Who are those people? What did you get me mixed up in? Jason exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated, he said. But we'll figure it out. I promise. Ella glanced at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with questions and fear. I don't know what to believe anymore. I thought I was just trying to survive, trying to keep my head above water. But this is something I never saw coming. Jason turned toward her, his gaze softening. I know. But we're in this together, Ella. And I'm not going to let anything happen to you. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the weight of the situation sinking in. Jason could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty hanging over them like a storm cloud. Ella's world had just been flipped upside down, and Jason knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as long as they stuck together, there was hope. They could get through this. For now, they were safe. But Jason knew it wouldn't last long. The storm was just beginning to gather, and he had no idea how far it would go. All he could do was make sure they survived it, one step at a time. The car hummed quietly as it cut through the night, the streetlights casting brief flashes of light against the darkened world outside. Ella gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white from the tension in her hands. Jason could feel the anxiety radiating off her in waves, and though he was just as worried, he tried to remain calm, to be the anchor she needed in this storm. "Where are we going?" Ella's voice was small, almost lost in the silence. She didn't meet his eyes as she spoke, her focus entirely on the road ahead. Jason glanced at her, his mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. The safe house he had in mind was a few hours away, isolated, secure, but far from the life she knew. They needed time to think, time to plan, and time to lie low. The last thing they needed was to be caught in the open. "We need to get out of town," Jason said quietly, his voice low but certain. "I've got a place we can stay for a little while, a safe house. It's off the grid, no one will find us there." Ella didn't respond right away, but Jason could see the uncertainty written all over her face. It wasn't just the danger, it was the uncertainty of what was next. She had no idea where this would lead, no idea who to trust. And Jason knew it wasn't fair to drag her into this unknown. "You don't have to do this, you know," Jason added, his voice softening. "I can help you find another way out. You don't have to go with me, but—" "No," Ella interrupted, her voice sharper than before. She glanced at him, her eyes hard, though they were still filled with fear. "I don't know what's happening, but I can't just go back to that life. To that diner. To whatever it is I've been trapped in. I can't pretend that everything is fine when it's not." Jason didn't know what to say to that. The pain in her voice was so raw, so real. She had always been so strong, so independent, but now, in this moment, she was broken in a way he didn't think he could fix. But he had to try. "You're not alone in this," he said softly. "We'll figure it out. I promise." Ella didn't reply, but her grip on the wheel loosened slightly, and for the first time since the gunshot had shattered the night, she seemed to breathe a little easier. Jason could see it, the faintest flicker of trust, the smallest crack in her armor. As they drove, the miles between them and the diner stretched out like a quiet distance, but Jason knew they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The people who had been tracking her weren't going to stop just because they got away this time. He could feel the weight of the danger still hovering over them, as palpable as the night air around them. After what seemed like hours, they finally turned down a narrow, winding road. The city lights faded completely, replaced by the deep shadows of trees and the soft rustle of wind. Jason knew they were getting close to the safe house, the small cottage that he'd kept hidden away for just such a situation. It was secluded, nestled in a quiet valley that no one would stumble upon without purpose. Ella's eyes flickered nervously at the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice almost too quiet. "Almost there," Jason replied, trying to reassure her, though he was equally on edge. He had no idea what would happen next. They had no plan, no clear way out of this mess. But at least they were safe, for now. The car slowed to a stop as they reached the small, weathered cottage. It looked almost abandoned, with its peeling paint and ivy creeping up the stone walls, but it was secure. The windows were reinforced, the doors locked from the inside. It wasn't much to look at, but it was the safest place Jason could offer. They got out of the car, and Jason led Ella inside, flicking on the lights to reveal a sparse interior. A small living room with a few mismatched chairs, a kitchen with basic appliances, and a loft bedroom. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't meant to be. It was a place to hide, to lay low, and to think. Ella stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, taking it all in. She looked small and vulnerable in the dim light, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. This place, she murmured, trailing off as she looked around. It feels so different from everything I've known. Jason turned toward her, meeting her eyes for the first time since they'd arrived. It's not much, but it's safe. We'll be okay here, Ella. For as long as we need. Ella nodded slowly, but Jason could see she wasn't convinced. She was still processing everything that had happened that night, everything Jason had told her about the dangerous people after her, and the fact that her life had just changed forever. I don't know what's going to happen next, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can handle all of this. I just wanted a simple life. A normal life. Jason took a step closer, his voice steady. I know. And I wish I could take away all the things that have hurt you. But what's happened, what's going on, none of it is your fault. You don't deserve this, Ella. But you're stronger than you think. Ella didn't respond, but Jason could see a flicker of something like hope, behind the exhaustion in her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she looked like she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. But before Jason could say anything more, there was a knock at the door. His heart dropped into his stomach. He wasn't expecting anyone. The only people who knew about this place were the ones he trusted completely, and none of them would knock. They would just walk in. Ella's face went pale as she glanced toward the door, fear flashing in her eyes. Who is that? Jason's hand instinctively went to his pocket, where his phone was tucked away. It was empty, no messages, no calls, just silence. Whoever was outside wasn't someone he knew. He gestured for Ella to stay back, moving quietly toward the door. His mind raced. It couldn't be a coincidence. Not now. With a steady hand, Jason peered through the peephole, his heart pounding. There was no way to know for sure who was on the other side, but something about the figure in the doorway made his gut twist. He could feel the danger lurking just beyond the door. The game had just changed again. Turning back to Ella, he whispered urgently, "Stay behind me. No matter what happens, don't move." Jason reached for the door handle, his pulse racing, his mind alert. Whatever was waiting for him on the other side, he would face it. He had to. The door opened. The door creaked as Jason slowly opened it, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel Ella's presence behind him, a silent weight of fear and uncertainty that made every move feel more significant. The last thing he wanted was to put her in any more danger, but he knew that whoever was outside wasn't someone who was just passing by. The tension was suffocating, the unknown pressing down on him like a storm cloud ready to burst. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, dressed in a dark coat and a baseball cap that shaded most of his face. Jason couldn't see much of his expression, but the man's posture was rigid, confident. There was something unmistakable about his presence, a sense of authority that set off alarms in Jason's mind. The stranger didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, as though he was waiting for Jason to say something. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Whoever this was, he wasn't about to let him in without a fight. "What do you want?" Jason asked, keeping his voice firm, his body angled slightly between the man and Ella, blocking her view from whatever might happen next. The stranger's lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice low but laced with an edge of menace. "And I think you know exactly who." Jason's mind raced. His first instinct was to deny everything, to play it cool. But the look in the man's eyes told him that wasn't going to work. This wasn't just some random person. This man knew something, and Jason wasn't about to let him drag Ella into whatever mess was brewing. I don't know who you're talking about, Jason replied evenly, doing his best to sound calm even as his pulse quickened. You've got the wrong place. The stranger chuckled darkly. Do I? I don't think so. His hand slid into the pocket of his coat, and Jason's heart skipped a beat. Was he reaching for a weapon? A gun? He couldn't afford to take any chances. Stay back, Jason said sharply, his voice gaining a dangerous edge. He stepped forward, putting himself between the stranger and the door. His hand hovered near the gun he kept hidden in his waistband. He'd never been one for violence, but right now, he wasn't willing to let this man put Ella in harm's way. The stranger's eyes flicked down to Jason's waist and then back up to his face, a look of mild amusement crossing his features. You think you can stop me? He asked, his tone almost mocking. I'm not here for a fight, but if you're going to make this difficult, we can do things the hard way. Jason's jaw tightened. The man's calmness only made him more dangerous. There was a cold, controlled quality to his demeanor that screamed experience. This wasn't just some thug or hired muscle, this was someone who knew how to play the game. And Jason was out of his league. Behind him, Jason could hear Ella's soft breathing, her fear palpable. He knew he had to get her out of this situation. She couldn't be involved any more than she already was. Jason's hand was still on his gun, but his mind was spinning. He had to think fast, had to figure out what this man wanted before things escalated. What do you want with her? Jason asked, his voice steady despite the tension coursing through him. She's not involved in whatever you're after. The stranger's smile widened, though it still held no warmth. Oh, I think she is, he said. She's in the middle of something much bigger than you realize. And I don't need you to make this harder for her. I just need her cooperation. His eyes flicked to Ella, who was standing just behind Jason, looking like a deer caught in headlights. Jason's blood ran cold. You don't get to threaten her, he said, his voice low and deadly. I'm not letting you hurt her. The man's smile faded, replaced by something darker, colder. I'm not here to hurt anyone. But if you continue to be uncooperative, I'll have no choice but to take matters into my own hands. Jason's grip tightened on his gun. He didn't want to escalate things, but he wasn't about to let this man intimidate him, or worse, take Ella. Before he could say anything more, the man shifted slightly, as though he was preparing to make a move. Jason's instincts kicked in. This was it. The moment of decision. He had to act fast, or they'd both be in serious trouble. Jason. Ella's voice was a whisper, but it was enough to pull his attention for a split second. Jason's head whipped around, and in that brief moment of distraction, the man lunged. He was fast, too fast. Jason barely had time to react before the stranger grabbed him by the wrist, twisting his arm behind his back and slamming him against the doorframe. Pain shot through Jason's body as his breath was knocked out of him. He tried to fight back, but the man's grip was like iron. His world spun as he struggled, but the man was relentless. Let go of him. Ella screamed, her voice breaking through the tension in the air. She had stepped forward, fear and determination in her eyes. Jason's heart raced. Ella was too close. If the man saw her as a threat, he wouldn't hesitate to hurt her. Jason's mind raced, but his body was trapped in the stranger's grip. You should have stayed out of this, the man said through clenched teeth, tightening his hold on Jason. But now you've made it personal. Ella didn't back down. Instead, she grabbed a nearby metal vase from the small table near the door and swung it with all her strength. The vase collided with the man's head with a sickening thud, and for a brief moment, he staggered back, disoriented. That was all the opening Jason needed. With a burst of strength, he pulled his arm free, delivering a hard blow to the man's side. The stranger grunted, but Jason wasn't done. He lunged forward, pushing the man out of the doorway and onto the porch. They both hit the ground with a heavy thud, the man groaning as he tried to regain his footing. Jason quickly stood, putting himself between the man and Ella. "Get inside!" Jason shouted at her, his voice urgent. Ella didn't hesitate this time. She ran toward the door, slamming it shut behind her as Jason faced down the man. The stranger was slowly getting to his feet, wiping the blood from his lip. His eyes were cold, seething with rage. "You've made a big mistake," he spat, his voice thick with anger. Jason wasn't intimidated. "I don't think so," he said, his voice calm, but deadly. "You're the one who's about to make a mistake." Before anything else could happen, Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he didn't have time to wonder who it was. He picked up the phone, keeping his eyes on the man in front of him. "Who is this?" Jason demanded, his voice tight with tension. The voice on the other end was familiar. "It's me, Jason. I need to talk. Now. You're not the only one being hunted. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" The cold night air bit at their skin as they pushed deeper into the woods. The sounds of their hurried footsteps were the only things that broke the stillness of the forest, echoing like a warning through the trees. Jason's mind raced as he kept glancing over his shoulder, knowing that every moment brought them closer to being caught. Whoever was chasing them, whoever had sent the man to their door, wasn't far behind. The stranger hadn't been the only threat. Ella stumbled slightly, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she tried to keep up. Jason could hear the raw fear in her breathing, and it made his chest tighten. He'd promised her safety, but right now, he wasn't even sure where they were headed. He just knew they had to keep moving. "Jason, where are we going?" Ella's voice was soft, strained from the running. Her eyes darted nervously around the woods, as though she expected something, or someone, to leap out at them from the darkness. Jason slowed his pace for a moment, just enough to look back at her. She was shaking, the terror written on her face, but there was something else there too. Something deeper, almost a sense of trust, despite everything that had happened. She had no idea what they were really running from. No idea how deep this rabbit hole went. But she was with him. She was trusting him. "We're going to a safe place," Jason said, though his own uncertainty clouded his voice. "I know a guy. He'll help us." It was a lie. Jason didn't know for sure if this guy would help them, or if they'd even make it there in time. The truth was, he was trying to buy time. Time to figure out how to get out of this mess. The woods felt endless. They'd been running for what felt like hours, their legs burning from the exertion. Jason's mind kept flashing back to that message. "They know where you're going. You're not safe. Run." It was like a ticking clock, the seconds counting down, and Jason had no idea when it would stop. Ella's voice cut through the dark again. "Why did they come after me, Jason? What do they want with me?" He hated that she had to ask. Hated that he couldn't give her a straight answer, the one she deserved. But the truth was complicated. Dangerous. And right now, he couldn't afford to tell her everything. Not yet. "You're in danger because of your father," Jason said, his voice quieter than before. "I know it doesn't make sense, but I promise, I'm going to protect you. I don't know everything, but I know they'll stop at nothing to get what they want from you." Ella's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition passing over her features. "My father? What do you mean? What does this have to do with him?" Jason's heart sank. He knew this was a conversation they couldn't avoid forever. But this wasn't the moment to lay it all out. Not when danger was closing in. "I'll explain it when we're safe," Jason said, forcing the words out as calmly as he could. "I promise." Ella didn't respond, but he could tell she wasn't convinced. She was terrified, and rightfully so. But Jason had to stay strong. For her. He pushed through the growing sense of dread creeping up his spine. He wasn't about to let their situation get worse. Not when they were so close to reaching the edge of the woods. The road was just ahead, where his car, was parked. They made it through the dense trees and into a small clearing. Jason squinted, the dim light from the moon barely illuminating the path ahead. His car was parked just a few yards away, an old sedan he'd used for years. It wasn't the most glamorous vehicle, but it was reliable. "Come on, we're almost there," he urged Ella, his voice low but insistent. Ella nodded, though the fear in her eyes hadn't completely faded. She kept her eyes on the shadows behind them, her gaze flicking nervously toward the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. Jason didn't know if she was hearing things, or if their pursuers were that close. But before he could reach for the door handle, the sound of a car engine roared to life in the distance. Jason froze. His heart lurched. "Get in the car," he hissed, grabbing Ella's wrist and pulling her toward the sedan. She didn't hesitate this time, jumping into the passenger seat as Jason slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. He started the engine with a quick twist of the key. The car sputtered to life, and Jason floored the gas pedal, sending the car speeding down the dark road, away from the woods and into the night. Behind them, the sound of the pursuing car grew louder. Jason could hear it, could feel it, whoever was chasing them wasn't far behind. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he glanced over at Ella. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the seat as though she were holding on for dear life. She didn't say anything for a few moments, but when she finally did, her voice trembled. "Jason, what's going on? Who are these people? Why are they after me? What does my father have to do with any of this?" Jason clenched his jaw, keeping his eyes focused on the road. He needed to think fast. They couldn't just keep running. Sooner or later, they'd run out of places to go, out of time. He had to figure out how to get them out of this mess before it was too late. "Listen to me, Ella," Jason said, his voice quieter now. "You're not the only one in danger. There are people, powerful people, who want something from your father. And they think you know something. Something that could destroy everything they've built. But I swear to you, I'm not going to let them get to you. I'll protect you, no matter what." Ella's lips parted, her face clouded with confusion and disbelief. "My father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What could I possibly know that would?" Jason's thoughts were racing, but he couldn't explain it all now. He could barely process it himself. "Just trust me," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "I know it's hard, but you have to trust me. I'm doing everything I can to protect you." Ella didn't say anything more. Her eyes remained locked on the road ahead, but Jason could see the storm of emotions playing out in her mind. Fear, confusion, doubt, and maybe just the slightest hint of hope. The car tore down the road, the sound of the engine echoing in the night. Jason glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart sinking. The headlights of the car following them were getting closer, and the unmistakable sound of tires screeching as they turned sharply filled the air. Whoever was behind them wasn't going to stop until they had Ella. They were almost out of time. Jason gritted his teeth and slammed his foot harder on the accelerator. The night swallowed them whole, but with every passing second, the danger grew closer. There was no going back now. They had to outrun the past, and whatever came with it, before it caught up to them. But Jason wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore. The tires screamed against the asphalt as Jason pushed the sedan harder, weaving through the empty highway in the dead of night. The engine roared in protest, but he ignored it, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his grip so tight on the steering wheel his knuckles turned white. Every second felt like an eternity, and every glance in the rearview mirror sent a fresh wave of panic through him. The headlights were still there, growing brighter, inching closer. Ella's hand gripped the door handle beside her, her body tense, her breath shallow. She hadn't spoken since the conversation about her father, and Jason knew the questions she had were still swirling in her mind. But there was no time to explain, not now, not when the danger was so close. His mind was consumed with one goal: survival. Keep running, keep moving, don't let them catch you. Jason, Ella's voice broke through the tension, soft but insistent. Where are we going? How long do we keep running? Her words cut through the thundering noise of the engine and the pounding of his heart. He wanted to answer her, wanted to give her the comfort she needed, but the truth was too complicated. There was no safe place anymore, no refuge. They were both deep in it now, entangled in something much larger than either of them could comprehend. I'm doing what I can, Jason replied, his voice strained. I know a place, but it's not far. Just hold on a little longer. Ella didn't respond, but Jason could feel the weight of her gaze on him, her silence pressing down on him like 100-pound weight. She wasn't asking him to explain everything right now, she was just asking him to keep her safe. And for the first time in a long while, Jason wasn't sure he could. The sound of the pursuing car grew louder, and Jason's eyes flicked back to the rearview mirror. The car was getting too close, too quickly. Whoever was behind them wasn't letting up, they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. They're not giving up, Jason muttered under his breath, his eyes flicking from the mirror back to the road. Ella looked back briefly, but quickly turned away, fear flashing across her face. Who are they? Why are they doing this? Jason's jaw tightened. There was no easy answer. The people after them were dangerous, merciless. And their goal wasn't clear, not to him, at least. But the connection to Ella's father was undeniable. Whoever these people were, they were determined to get their hands on something that Ella, for reasons unknown, seemed to hold the key to. I don't have all the answers, he said, keeping his tone low. But we'll figure it out. Just keep your head down, okay? Trust me. Ella nodded slowly, but her gaze remained fixed on the road. The fear was still there, but there was something else now too, something like a quiet determination. She was a fighter. Jason could see it in her eyes. A flash of headlights in the rearview mirror cut through the night like a blade. The car pursuing them had closed the gap. Jason's grip on the wheel tightened, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. He couldn't keep outrunning them forever. Then, without warning, the pursuing car swerved, a blur of motion in the rearview mirror. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Had they lost control? No. They were just getting started. A quick glance at the dashboard showed he was reaching the edge of town. There was an exit coming up, an old, narrow road that led toward the mountains. It was a long shot, but if they could make it there, the roads would be harder to navigate. It was a risky move, but he had no choice. Hold on tight, Jason said, his voice low but urgent. We're taking the next exit. Ella's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded and braced herself as Jason yanked the wheel hard to the right, cutting across the lanes and onto the exit ramp. The car skidded slightly as he corrected the turn, but he kept the pedal pressed to the floor, the tires biting into the gravel and dirt of the old road. Behind them, the pursuing car didn't hesitate. The headlights followed them, undeterred by the rough terrain. Jason's stomach churned. Whoever was behind them was relentless. Jason's mind raced for a solution, a way to lose them. He couldn't keep going at this speed, it was too dangerous, too risky. They needed cover, and they needed it fast. He spotted a small dirt trail to the left, half hidden behind some thick trees and overgrowth. It was the kind of place no one would think to look, and it led up into the hills. The perfect place to disappear, if only for a little while. Without thinking, he veered left, the tires crunching over the uneven ground as the car bounded up the trail. The headlights behind them flickered, the pursuing car hesitant for just a moment as it struggled to keep up. But Jason didn't have time to look back. His focus was on the path ahead. Are you okay? he asked Ella, glancing at her quickly as he maneuvered the car through the narrow trail. She nodded, her face pale but set. Just, keep going. Jason could hear the sounds of the car behind them, still coming closer, the pursuit unwavering. But the trail was narrow, winding, and steep. If they could keep their lead, maybe they could make it to the top and lose them. As they ascended further into the hills, Jason's mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want with Ella? And what was her father involved in? Jason had learned not to trust easily, but Ella was different. There was something in her eyes, something in the way she carried herself. She wasn't just another victim caught in the crossfire, she was strong. And whatever was happening, Jason knew she would fight to the end to survive. That strength was something Jason had come to rely on more than he realized. The car behind them was gaining again, too fast, too close. Jason's hands clenched into fists, frustration and desperation building inside him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They weren't supposed to be on the run like this. They weren't supposed to be facing down a future that was so uncertain. He pushed the pedal to the metal, but the road ahead was getting steeper, the terrain rougher. They needed to make it to the top. They needed to outrun them. Just a little further. The sound of the engine behind them grew louder again. They were close, too close. And then, suddenly, the car ahead of them, the one chasing them, swerved violently, its headlights flashing wildly as it lost control and veered off the road. Jason's heart leapt into his throat. He wasn't sure what had happened, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. Hang on! Jason shouted, throwing the car into a sharp turn to the left, narrowly avoiding a tree on the edge of the trail. They had made it. For now. The sound of the car engine sputtered as Jason's sedan rocked on the uneven terrain. The dirt path they were on had grown rougher, the climb steeper, and Jason knew they couldn't push the car much longer. The rearview mirror told the story. What was once the distant glow of headlights was now completely gone. The pursuers had lost them. For now. Jason didn't dare relax, though. His eyes scanned the darkened landscape as they crested the top of the hill, and the road finally leveled off, offering a view of the valley below. The silhouette of the town in the distance looked peaceful, as if everything were normal, but Jason knew better. Nothing about this situation was normal. The car slowed to a crawl, and Jason pulled over to the side of the trail, letting the engine idle for a moment. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing a breath he'd been holding since they first took off. Ella, still tense, had been staring out of the window, her face reflecting the dim light of the dashboard. Her eyes were wide, as if she was absorbing everything but still struggling to make sense of it all. "Are we safe?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Jason wasn't sure how to answer that. Safe? What did that even mean anymore? "We're safe for now," he replied, forcing the words out. "But we can't stop here. We need to move. They'll be looking for us." Ella nodded but didn't say anything more. She was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and Jason could see the toll the night had taken on her. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with worry. Her grip on the door handle hadn't loosened, and Jason noticed how her fingers trembled slightly. She was terrified. And he couldn't blame her. He looked out at the trail ahead. There were no signs of the pursuing car, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they figured out the path they had taken. The trail was too obvious, too easy to follow. They needed to get to a safer place, a real safe place. But where? "Do you have somewhere in mind?" Ella asked, breaking the silence. Jason hesitated. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he should even tell her. But she deserved to know. She deserved the truth. "There's a cabin," he said, looking at her with a faint, reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not far from here. We can stay there for a while, figure things out. It's remote, off the grid." Ella's eyes searched his face for a moment, gauging whether or not she could trust him. She was still so unsure, so lost in this whirlwind of danger, but something in Jason's gaze must have reassured her. "How do you know about this place?" Ella asked, her voice quiet but curious. Jason took a breath, looking away for a moment. "I've been there before. It's a place where I go to get away from things. It's the only place I can think of where we might be safe for a bit." Ella nodded slowly, but Jason could see that the doubt was still there. "You've been to this place before," she repeated. "But you didn't mention it until now." Jason looked at her, his gaze hardening slightly. "It's not a place I tell people about. It's not something I talk about, ever. But right now, it's the best option we have." Ella said nothing more, but her silence said it all. She didn't need to ask any more questions, she had already started putting the pieces together in her mind. Jason wasn't just a regular guy. There was something about him, something more than what he'd let on. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel it. She could feel the weight of his past, the shadows that trailed behind him. They both understood that whatever happened next, it would change everything. Jason started the engine again and began moving the car forward, keeping a steady pace as they wound down the hill. The trail narrowed as it snaked its way through the thick forest, with trees looming over them like silent sentinels. They were in the wilderness now, far from the safety of town, far from any help. It was just them against whatever came next. The cabin was about 20 miles away, deep in the heart of the forest, far enough that no one would think to look. Jason had always found it a good place to think, to get away from the chaos of his life. It was a simple cabin, hidden from the world. But it wasn't just a retreat, it was a refuge, a place where he could escape from the weight of everything, even if only for a little while. As they drove, the silence between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken words. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse from here. The people chasing them weren't going to stop, they couldn't stop, not until they had what they wanted. And Jason still had no idea what that was. He glanced over at Ella. Her face was bathed in the dim light of the dashboard, her features soft but weary. She had closed her eyes, and for a moment, Jason wondered if she was sleeping. But then she opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I don't understand why they're after me," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Jason took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. He couldn't tell her everything, not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things he didn't know himself. But she deserved to know something. She deserved to understand why this was happening to her. "You're tied to something, something your father was involved in," he said, his voice low. "Something dangerous. And whoever these people are, they think you know something about it. Something that could ruin them." Ella's eyes widened slightly. "My father? But he's just a businessman. He doesn't have anything to do with—" "I don't know the details," Jason interrupted, cutting her off gently. "But I know your father was mixed up in something he shouldn't have been. I don't know what, and I don't know how deep it goes. But you're caught in the middle of it now. And they won't stop until they get whatever it is they're after." Ella looked down at her hands, her fingers gripping the seat in front of her. The weight of his words seemed to sink in slowly, and Jason could see her mind spinning, trying to make sense of it all. "Why me?" she whispered, almost to herself. "Why do they think I know something?" Jason didn't have the answer to that. "I don't know," he said again, his voice heavy with the uncertainty he felt. "But I swear to you, Ella, I'm going to keep you safe. No matter what." Ella looked at him then, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "I don't know what's happening, Jason. But I trust you. Just don't let them get to me." Jason nodded, his heart heavy. He had to keep his promise. He had to keep her safe. Whatever it took. As they drove through the night, the world outside seemed to blur, the trees passing by in a rush of shadows and moonlight. And Jason knew, deep down, that this was the beginning of something bigger than either of them could ever imagine. The road ahead was uncertain, and the dangers were only beginning to show their face. But for now, they had each other. And that had to be enough. For now, it had to be enough. The silence in the car had settled over them again, thick and heavy. Jason's grip on the steering wheel tightened as they navigated the winding road. The forest was dense, the night enveloping everything around them, only the dim headlights illuminating the way forward. Ella sat quietly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken since their exchange about her father. Jason could feel the weight of her thoughts, her confusion, and the growing realization that her life was no longer the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. The cabin was still about 10 miles away, but the closer they got, the more Jason could feel the intensity in the air. The night seemed to hold its breath. The road began to narrow, and the trees crowded closer to the path, casting long, eerie shadows over the car. It felt like they were entering another world entirely, one that was far removed from the life they'd known. Jason's mind was racing, but his thoughts kept coming back to Ella. She was the key to this whole mess, and yet, she had no idea what that meant. Jason couldn't help but wonder what would happen once she learned the truth about her father's involvement in all of this. It was only a matter of time before she found out. And when that happened, she would have to decide who to trust, and who to fight. "I'm sorry," Ella's voice broke through the quiet, soft but steady. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." She turned her head to look at him, her gaze heavy, but her expression was unreadable. "I know I've been asking a lot of questions, but I don't know what else to do." Jason glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You don't need to apologize. You have every right to ask questions. But I need you to understand, Ella, this isn't easy for either of us. There's a lot I don't know, a lot I can't explain. I wish I could." Ella nodded slowly, her eyes flickering back to the dark road ahead. I don't understand why this is happening. Why now? Why me?" Jason's heart clenched. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to offer her the comfort of answers, but the truth was, he didn't have them all. He only had pieces, scattered fragments of a puzzle that was far too complex for either of them to solve right now. "It's not about you, Ella," Jason said quietly. "It's about something your father got involved in. Something much bigger than both of us. And now they're after you because they think you know something, even if you don't." Ella turned to face him, her expression softening, but the suspicion in her eyes remained. "I don't know what to believe. But I'm starting to see that the only way to figure this out is to keep moving. I can't stay stuck in the past. And I need to understand what happened to my father." Jason's throat tightened. This wasn't something he could give her. Not yet. "Ella, But before he could finish, the sudden sound of a loud thud echoed through the air, followed by a sharp, unnatural screeching noise. Jason's head snapped to the right, his eyes widening in alarm. The road they were on had suddenly taken a sharp bend, and ahead of them, something was blocking their path. A dark shape, barely visible in the dim light, stood at the curve. It was too late for Jason to brake. "Hold on," he shouted, his heart racing. Without thinking, he swerved the car hard to the left, tires screeching as the car jolted across the gravel. He fought to regain control, his hands shaking as he turned the wheel sharply. The car fishtailed, narrowly missing the dark shape ahead. And then, just as quickly as the danger had appeared, the road ahead seemed clear again. Ella gasped, her hands gripping the seat as the car continued to slide, but Jason managed to steady it just in time. The headlights illuminated a small clearing, where the road opened up slightly before veering off into the forest again. Jason's heart hammered in his chest, but his mind was already racing. The danger hadn't passed. He glanced at Ella, who was wide-eyed, still processing the near miss. "What the hell was that?" she asked breathlessly, her voice strained. Did someone just try to stop us? Jason's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, expecting to see the headlights of a pursuing car. But there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of road behind them. I don't know, Jason muttered under his breath, his mind working through the possibilities. He couldn't afford to waste any time. Someone had been waiting for them. Whoever was after them had stepped up their game. They needed to move quickly. Jason's foot slammed on the gas again, pushing the car faster, accelerating up the narrow path that would lead them to the cabin. He didn't dare look back, his focus entirely on the road ahead. "We're almost there," he said, trying to steady his voice. Ella nodded, her lips pressed tightly together, but Jason could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. She was no longer the person she was before, someone with a regular life, a job, a future. She was now part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. The forest around them seemed to close in, the trees looming like sentinels as the trail twisted and turned. Jason's nerves were on edge, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. He could feel the tension rising in the air, a sense of something building, something inevitable. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Jason said, his voice low, almost to himself. "They're not going to stop until they get what they want. And they're not going to leave you alone." Ella's expression shifted, a new resolve settling over her face. She wasn't backing down. "Not now. I won't let them control my life anymore. I'll find out what happened to my father, no matter what it takes. I won't let anyone hurt me, or you." Jason's heart skipped a beat. There was a fire in her eyes now, a determination that he hadn't seen before. It was raw, unyielding. Ella had shifted. She wasn't the scared girl who had stumbled into this nightmare, she was becoming something stronger. She was ready to fight. The road ahead was dark, but Jason knew that this was the moment everything would change. They were no longer running from the past. They were heading straight into it, ready to face whatever truths lay waiting. And no matter what happened, Jason would be there beside her. They didn't have the luxury of turning back anymore. He slammed the accelerator down, pushing the car faster toward the cabin and whatever answers it might hold. In the distance, the faint outline of the cabin emerged, just visible through the trees. They were almost there. And this time, they weren't just hiding, they were preparing to uncover the truth. The headlights of the car cut through the dense forest, illuminating the winding path as Jason pushed the pedal to the floor. The cabin, now just a few hundred yards away, seemed to emerge from the shadows like a forgotten relic from another life. The weathered wood of the cabin's exterior was barely visible through the trees, and the porch light flickered dimly, as if the place had been abandoned for years. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The cabin had always been a refuge, a place of solitude. But tonight, it felt like the eye of a storm. The cabin wasn't just a retreat from the world, it was a place that held secrets, and those secrets were starting to unravel. "We're almost there," Jason said, glancing over at Ella, who was gripping the seat with white-knuckled hands, her face pale from the tension. Ella didn't respond. She was staring out the window, her eyes searching the darkness as if trying to prepare herself for whatever awaited them. Her thoughts, like Jason's, were spinning. There was no more pretending that everything would be okay. The truth was right in front of them now, danger, mystery, and a past that neither of them could outrun. As they reached the end of the trail, Jason slowed the car, taking a sharp left toward the cabin. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, and the car came to a stop in front of the small porch. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world outside was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Jason turned off the engine, but the silence in the car felt suffocating. "I thought this place was supposed to be remote," Ella said quietly, breaking the stillness. "There's no one around. It feels like we're the only people left in the world." Jason exhaled slowly, pushing open his door. "It's remote enough. No one will find us here, at least not right away." Ella followed suit, stepping out into the cool night air. The weight of the situation settled in on her shoulders. There was no running anymore. They were at a crossroads, and there was no turning back. The cabin looked more worn than Jason remembered. The wooden planks on the exterior were cracked and peeling, and the windows were dark, giving the place a sense of abandonment. But inside, it was still familiar, still the sanctuary it had always been for him. Jason reached the porch first and pushed the door open, revealing the dim interior. The faint scent of pine and old wood filled the air. It was quiet, too quiet. Ella hesitated on the doorstep, her eyes scanning the dark room beyond. "It's just an old cabin," Jason said, his voice soft. "Nothing to be afraid of." Ella didn't answer. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick, creaky wooden floors. Jason closed the door behind them and locked it, the sound echoing in the stillness. They were alone. And yet, the place didn't feel like it. Jason flicked on a few lights, casting a dim glow over the room. The interior was sparse but cozy, a few mismatched chairs around a low table, a stone fireplace with a stack of logs beside it, and a kitchen that seemed stuck in time. The cabin had always been simple, just enough to survive, just enough to escape the world. But tonight, it felt suffocating. "I'll make us some coffee," Jason said, trying to break the tension. His movements were mechanical as he moved toward the kitchen, his mind running through everything that had happened in the past few days. The people chasing them, the lies, the mysteries surrounding her father, it was all too much, too overwhelming. Ella followed him into the kitchen, her eyes searching every corner of the room, as though looking for something. Jason had always found peace here, but now it was hard to ignore the feeling that this place was no longer a refuge. There was something wrong about it, something hidden just beneath the surface. "I don't need coffee," Ella said quietly, her voice distant. "I'm not sure I can even sleep right now." Jason paused, turning to face her. Her face was drawn, her eyes tired and filled with worry. He could see the weight of everything pressing down on her. She wasn't just afraid anymore, she was scared for her life. And he couldn't blame her. "You'll need rest," Jason said softly. "We've had a long night, and you won't be any good to anyone if you're running on empty." Ella nodded, but there was still something in her eyes, a deep uncertainty that Jason couldn't shake. "Do you think we're safe here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason didn't answer right away. He wanted to tell her yes. He wanted to promise her that they were safe, that no one would find them here. But the truth was, he couldn't make that promise. Not anymore. "I think we're safe for now," he finally said, his voice steady despite the doubt gnawing at him. "But this is just a temporary place. We can't stay here forever. It's too dangerous." Ella nodded, though she didn't seem reassured. She moved to the couch and sat down, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold on to something, anything, that would make her feel less vulnerable. Jason turned away, pouring 2 mugs of coffee, but he didn't drink. He wasn't sure why, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had a strange sense of foreboding, as though something was off. His instincts were rarely wrong, and right now, they were screaming at him to be careful. He set the mugs down on the table in front of her, but Ella didn't seem to notice. She was lost in her thoughts again, staring off into the darkness beyond the windows. Jason took a seat opposite her, the silence stretching between them. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running," Ella said, breaking the quiet once more. Her voice was low, barely audible, but Jason heard the desperation in her words. "I don't know who to trust anymore. I don't even know what's real." Jason leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking with hers. "I know this is hard. But we're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. We'll find the answers, Ella. I promise you that." But as the words left his mouth, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying to her, lying to himself. The truth was, they were both in over their heads, and no matter how much he wanted to protect her, there was no escaping the truth that was closing in on them. Ella's eyes flickered toward him, a glimmer of something, hope, maybe, dancing in their depths. But she didn't say anything more. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the night. Jason stared into his coffee mug, lost in thought, trying to figure out what their next move would be. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. The cabin was still, the only sounds the occasional creak of wood settling as the night wore on. Jason sat across from Ella, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't quite organize. He glanced at her, watching the way her fingers nervously traced the rim of her coffee mug. She was clearly lost in thought, still processing everything that had happened over the past few days. Jason had been trying to hold it all together, but the longer they stayed here, the more it felt like everything was about to crack wide open. He could feel the weight of it, the quiet pressure building in the air, the sense that the calm before the storm was slipping away. He had to tell her the truth. He had to explain what had happened, why things were escalating so quickly. But he couldn't. Not yet. The thought gnawed at him. There was still too much danger. Too many unknowns. The people after them weren't going to stop until they had answers, and the last thing he wanted was to drag Ella deeper into a situation she couldn't escape. Ella's voice broke through his thoughts, a quiet tremor in her words. "Jason, I need to know something." Jason met her gaze, his heart skipping a beat. "Anything." She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her eyes intense. "You're not telling me everything, are you? I mean, I know you're trying to protect me, but I don't think I can take any more secrets." Jason felt his stomach tighten. The truth was, he hadn't wanted to tell her everything. He didn't want her to carry the burden of knowing what he knew, what they both knew. But she was right, he couldn't protect her from this forever. "No, you're right," Jason admitted, his voice thick. "I haven't been completely honest with you. But there are things I don't even fully understand yet. Things that your father got involved in." Ella's eyes widened, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. She leaned forward, her expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "What does my father have to do with any of this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jason swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of the question pressing down on him, the moment of reckoning approaching. But he had to tell her now. "Your father," Jason began, his voice tight, "he wasn't just an ordinary businessman. He got tangled up with some very dangerous people. People who deal in things that, well, they're not things you can walk away from." Ella's brow furrowed, and she shook her head. "What do you mean? What kind of people?" Jason took a deep breath. "He was involved in organized crime, Ella. Money laundering. Weapons trafficking. The kind of stuff that, when it gets out of hand, leaves people dead." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. Ella's face drained of color, her eyes wide as she tried to process what he was saying. "No. No, that can't be right. My father? He was always so. I mean, he was a businessman." Jason shook his head, his expression grim. "I know. I thought the same thing. But your father wasn't who you thought he was. He was playing a dangerous game with people who don't care about anyone. They only care about power. And now, they're looking for you. Because they think you know something." Ella's breath caught in her throat, and she blinked rapidly, trying to keep her composure. "No. No, I didn't know anything. I swear, Jason. I don't know anything." Jason leaned forward, his voice soft but urgent. "It's not about what you know, Ella. It's about who you are. You're his daughter, and they believe you're connected to the things he was involved in. They think you can lead them to the answers they're looking for." The room seemed to spin as Ella's mind tried to make sense of everything. She had known her father as a man of wealth and influence, a pillar of the community. He was the one who had given her everything, who had supported her dreams and ambitions. The idea that he could have been involved in something so dark, so sinister, it was impossible to wrap her mind around. But why didn't you tell me this before? Ella's voice cracked, the anger and hurt rising in her chest. Why did you let me keep living this lie? Why didn't you warn me? Jason closed his eyes for a moment, guilt flooding him. I didn't want to drag you into this. I thought I could protect you from it. But I see now that I can't. And I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry. Ella took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. This whole time, I've been thinking my life was just, normal. And now, everything's a lie. Who the hell was my father, Jason? What am I supposed to do with all of this? Jason stood up, walking over to the window and staring out at the night. The tension in the air was suffocating, and his mind was racing. He couldn't take back what had happened. The damage had been done. We can't undo the past, Ella, he said softly. But we can figure out how to move forward. The only thing we can do now is stay one step ahead of the people who are coming for us. Ella didn't say anything at first. She simply sat there, her expression unreadable. Jason could feel the pain radiating from her, the weight of everything she was trying to absorb. But there was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't giving up. She was stronger than she thought. I don't know what to believe anymore, she finally whispered, her voice distant. But I know one thing. I'm not going to just sit here and wait for them to find me. I'm not running anymore, Jason. I need to find out what really happened. Jason's chest tightened with admiration for her resolve. He had never seen her so determined. In that moment, Ella wasn't just the woman caught in a whirlwind of chaos. She was someone ready to take control, to reclaim her life and her truth. I'm with you, Jason said, his voice steady. I'll help you. We'll find out what happened to your father, together. Ella met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. Then let's do this. But we need to be smart about it. No more running. No more hiding. Jason nodded. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The truth was out in the open now, and it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about uncovering the depths of a conspiracy that could destroy them both. And no matter what it took, they would get to the bottom of it. Together. The storm was coming, but they were ready to face it head-on. The morning sun barely pierced the thick forest canopy, casting faint beams of light through the trees. Jason and Ella stood on the porch of the cabin, their breath visible in the crisp air, the weight of their decision hanging over them. They had decided, no more running, no more hiding. They were going to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. Ella hadn't spoken much since their conversation last night. Her mind was still processing the revelation about her father, about everything that had been kept from her for so long. The truth was like a heavy fog in her brain, clouding everything she thought she knew about her life. Jason could sense her inner turmoil. He wasn't exactly in a better place. His own guilt weighed on him. He had been so focused on protecting her, on keeping her out of this mess, that he hadn't realized she needed the truth more than anything. The truth was the only way she could take control of her own future, and now that they were both in this together, they couldn't afford to hide from it any longer. Are you ready? Jason asked, his voice low but firm. Ella looked at him, her eyes steady but tired. She gave him a slow nod. I have to be. I can't just keep living in the dark. Jason's gaze softened. I know. And I'm not leaving you to face this alone. We'll figure it out together, I promise. For a moment, they both stood in silence, the sound of the forest the only thing breaking the quiet. The world felt different now, like they were standing on the edge of something huge, something they couldn't possibly understand yet. Ella exhaled slowly. Where do we start? Jason had been thinking about that all night. The truth about her father was more tangled than he'd initially realized. There were so many layers, so many people involved, that they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. But he had one lead, one place they could start, the address on the envelope her father had left behind. "We start with that envelope," Jason said, his eyes narrowing with determination. "The one your father left for you. There's something there." "I'm sure of it." Ella nodded, her mind already working. "The address. The one I found after he died." Jason's gaze turned thoughtful. "Yeah. It could be a safe house, or a place where he kept something important. Either way, we need to go there and see what we can find." Ella glanced back at the cabin, the place that had provided them shelter and safety for the past few days. But now, the calmness of the cabin felt like a false sense of security. They couldn't stay here forever. There were too many unanswered questions, too much at stake. "Let's go," Ella said, her voice firm, as though she were steeling herself for the journey ahead. The drive was long, the narrow roads twisting and turning through the dense forest. Neither of them spoke much on the way there. The air between them was heavy, filled with the weight of their shared mission. Jason kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing with possible scenarios. But every time he thought about her father's involvement in the criminal world, a knot twisted in his stomach. They had no idea what they would find at that address, but Jason was certain of one thing: it would change everything. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the outskirts of a small town. The address on the envelope led them here: no fancy buildings, no clear signs of wealth. The town was small, run down even, with little more than a few homes and a couple of businesses. Ella stared out the window, her eyes scanning the area. She felt a tightness in her chest. Something about this place felt wrong. She could almost sense the danger lurking around every corner. Jason pulled up to a dilapidated house at the edge of town, a place that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The windows were cracked, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. It was a far cry from the life her father had portrayed to her. Ella swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her stomach. "This is it," Jason said quietly, parking the car by the curb. "This is where it ends." Ella didn't respond. She simply opened the car door, stepping into the dirt driveway. Jason followed her, his hand instinctively moving to the gun tucked into his waistband. He wasn't sure what they were walking into, but he was ready for whatever came next. The house loomed before them, silent and still. As they approached the front door, Ella hesitated, her heart racing. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when everything would finally be revealed. "Are you sure about this?" Jason asked, his voice low. Ella glanced at him, her face pale but resolute. "There's no going back, Jason. I have to know the truth." Jason nodded, and together, they moved up the porch steps. The wooden boards creaked beneath their weight, the sound echoing in the quiet air. Ella reached out and grasped the doorknob, her fingers trembling as she turned it. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing a dark and musty interior. The air inside was thick with dust, as if the house had been abandoned for years. But there was something else, something more unsettling about the place. Jason stepped inside first, his senses on high alert. He scanned the room, noting the faded furniture, the piles of old newspapers, and the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Everything about this house screamed neglect. "This doesn't feel right," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible. "It feels like someone's been here recently." Jason didn't answer. Instead, he moved deeper into the house, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun. They were both on edge, aware that they were walking into an unknown situation. Suddenly, a loud noise came from upstairs, a thud followed by a muffled sound. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Someone was here. "Stay behind me," Jason ordered softly, his tone sharp. Ella nodded, stepping back as Jason moved forward cautiously. They made their way up the stairs, each step creaking beneath their feet. The hallway at the top was dark, but Jason could make out the faint outline of a door at the end. Without a word, he reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a small room that was cluttered with old boxes and stacks of paper. But in the center of the room, illuminated by a faint light, was a desk, its surface covered in documents, photographs, and a few old files. Jason motioned for Ella to come closer. "This is it," he whispered. "This is where your father kept everything." Ella's eyes widened as she stepped forward, her gaze falling on the papers scattered across the desk. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The truth was finally within reach. But as she looked at the papers, her eyes froze on something in particular, a photograph, crumpled at the edge of the pile. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she turned it over. And what she saw made her blood run cold. There, in the photo, was a man she had never seen before. A man standing next to her father, smiling. But the man wasn't just anyone. He was someone she recognized, someone she had seen only a few days ago. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This man, this was the person who had been following them. The man who had been chasing them from the beginning. "Jason," she gasped, her voice shaking. This is him. The man we've been running from." Jason's gaze hardened as he looked at the photograph. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they were forming was darker than either of them could have imagined. And now, they were in too deep. Ella's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph, her heart racing. The man in the picture wasn't just any stranger, he was the man who had been following them, watching their every move. The connection between him and her father was undeniable now. This was no coincidence. Her father had known him, and whatever had happened between them was much deeper than she'd ever realized. Jason stood behind her, his jaw clenched, his body tense as he surveyed the room. He had seen the same recognition flicker in her eyes when she looked at the photo, and his mind was already racing, calculating their next move. "Who is he?" Ella whispered, her voice barely audible, as if saying the name would make everything too real. Jason took a deep breath and glanced at the photograph in her hand. "I don't know. But I've seen him before. We've crossed paths before, back when I was working undercover. He's bad news, Ella. Really bad news." Ella's stomach dropped. She looked at Jason, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean, bad news? What kind of man is he?" Jason hesitated, his face hardening. "The kind of man who doesn't hesitate to kill anyone who stands in his way. He's connected to some very dangerous people. People I've been tracking for years." Ella's head spun. "Wait, so my father was involved with him? Was he, working for them?" Jason nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. Your father got tangled up in something far bigger than he could handle. And now it's coming back to bite us." Ella's mind raced. She had been living in a lie, surrounded by people she thought she could trust. Her father had been someone she admired, someone she looked up to. The idea that he had been living a double life, involved with criminals and dangerous men like the one in the photo, shattered everything she thought she knew about him. But why? Ella whispered, her voice cracking. "Why would he do that? He was always so kind to me. He never showed any signs of being involved in something like this." Jason placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "Sometimes, people get in too deep. They make choices that don't seem like choices at all. Maybe your father thought he could control it. Maybe he thought he could get out. But once you're in with people like him," he nodded toward the photograph, "there's no getting out. And now, they're coming for you." Ella shook her head, the weight of his words suffocating her. She had trusted her father with her life, and now it felt like he had betrayed her. "So, what do we do now?" Jason's gaze was steely. We fight. We figure out who he is and what he wants. We don't have much time, Ella. If he's already been following us, he knows we're close. We have to stay ahead of him. Ella's heart hammered in her chest. She was no longer just a daughter searching for answers, she was a target. And the man in the photo was hunting her. Jason stepped back, looking at the cluttered room around them. We need to go through these files. See if we can find anything that links him to your father, something we can use to track him down. Ella nodded, her mind numb, and moved toward the desk. Her hands shook as she began sifting through the papers. She couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. The man in the picture kept flashing in her mind. What had her father gotten himself into? And what did he leave behind that could help them now? It felt like the walls were closing in, the air thick with tension. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath them. Jason's voice cut through the stillness. Ella, I need you to stay focused. We're close to something. I can feel it. Ella nodded again, her resolve starting to harden. She couldn't afford to let fear paralyze her. She had to keep going, had to stay strong, not just for herself, but for Jason, too. They were in this together. They spent the next hour poring over the papers, looking for anything that could give them a lead. There were contracts, photographs, names, lots of names, many of which she didn't recognize. Some were familiar, though. People she had seen in her father's office, at business meetings, but never once had she suspected anything more sinister than business dealings. But now, she could see the connections. She could see how it all fit together, her father's connections, his deals, the web of deceit that had been hidden in plain sight. Jason's voice broke through her thoughts. Ella, look at this. He was holding up a document with a set of coordinates written on it, scribbled hastily in the margin. Ella squinted at the paper, a chill running down her spine. The coordinates weren't far from where they were. In fact, they were only about an hour's drive away. This could be it, Jason said, his voice low but urgent. This could be where they're hiding or where they're meeting. It could be the next step in all of this. Ella's mind raced. The location had to be important, but it also meant they were getting closer to the danger. If they went there, they were diving deeper into the world her father had been a part of, a world full of criminals who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. We can't just walk in there blindly, Ella said, her voice shaking but steady. We need a plan. Jason's eyes were intense, his focus unshakable. We'll make a plan, but we don't have much time. If we're going to do this, we need to do it now. Ella swallowed hard. She was scared, terrified even, but something inside her had shifted. She couldn't sit back any longer. She needed answers. And if it meant risking everything, then so be it. We go together, Ella said firmly, her voice shaking but resolute. We face this together, no more secrets. No more running. Jason gave her a tight nod, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. We're in this together. With that, they gathered what they needed, flashlights, a map, a few basic tools, and made their way to the car. The drive to the coordinates was tense, the silence between them heavier than it had ever been. Ella could feel the danger ahead, feel the darkness closing in, but she also knew that this was the only way to get to the truth. They were going to face it head-on. They didn't know what they would find when they arrived, but they had no other choice. The man in the photo was waiting for them. And they were ready to face him, no matter what. The car's headlights cut through the night as they drove deeper into the unknown, their journey into the heart of danger beginning. With every mile that passed, Ella felt herself being pulled further into the darkness of her father's hidden life. There was no turning back now. The truth was waiting, and they were about to confront it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The drive felt like an eternity. The road ahead was narrow, winding through thick trees that cast long, foreboding shadows over the car. Ella's grip tightened on the seat, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The coordinates had led them out of town, farther than she had expected. They were headed into the wilderness, to a place she had never even heard of, much less imagined she would be in. Jason's expression was unreadable as he focused on the road. He was a man of action, always calculating, always 2 steps ahead. But tonight, Ella could see the strain in his posture, the weight of the decisions pressing down on him. The stakes had never been higher. Ella glanced at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you think we're going to find when we get there?" Jason's eyes flicked to her for a moment, then back to the road. "I don't know. But we have to find out. It's the only way to get answers." She nodded, but deep down, a cold knot of fear twisted in her stomach. Her father's life had been shrouded in secrecy, and now it seemed like every step they took was pulling her deeper into a world of lies and danger. But the truth was just ahead, and she couldn't stop now. There was no turning back. She had to know. The road became bumpier as they drove further into the forest. The headlights illuminated nothing but trees and the occasional clearing, but soon the landscape began to change. The woods thinned out, and in the distance, Ella could make out the silhouette of a building. It was the first sign of civilization they had seen for miles. "We're close," Jason said, his voice low. "Stay alert." Ella took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. They were so close now. They had followed the clues, deciphered the codes, and everything had led them to this moment. Whatever was waiting for them at the end of this road, they would have to face it together. The building loomed in front of them as they approached, a large, run-down warehouse, its walls covered in grime, the windows dark and empty. It looked abandoned, but Ella knew better. There was something sinister about it, something that made her blood run cold. Jason stopped the car a short distance away, the engine's hum the only sound in the still night. He turned to Ella, his expression serious. "Whatever happens in there, don't go off on your own. We stay together, got it?" he said, his tone more urgent than before. Ella nodded. "I'm with you." They stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at their skin. The moon was barely visible through the thick clouds, leaving the world in near darkness. The only sound was the crunch of gravel underfoot as they made their way toward the warehouse. Jason kept a hand on his gun, his senses heightened, and Ella couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. As they neared the entrance, a rusted metal door loomed ahead. It was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges in the wind. Jason looked at Ella, his eyes narrowed. "I'll go first," he whispered. Ella's breath caught in her throat, but she knew it was the right decision. Jason had the experience, the training. He was their best shot at making it out of here alive. She followed him closely, her pulse pounding in her ears. Jason pushed the door open with a soft groan. The air inside was stale, the smell of mold and oil hanging thick in the air. The room was vast, with shadows stretching across the floor. There were crates scattered around, old furniture stacked in corners, and a faint sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper inside. "Stay close," Jason murmured, as they moved deeper into the warehouse. Every step felt heavier than the last, the silence pressing down on them. Ella's heart raced as she followed him through the maze of crates and shadows. She could feel it now, the danger that had been creeping ever closer since they left the cabin. But there was something else, too. A sense of inevitability. The truth was waiting here, and they couldn't turn back now. A soft sound came from further inside, a door creaking open, followed by the faintest whisper of a voice. Ella froze. She knew that voice. It was the same voice from the phone calls, the one that had been lurking in the background of her life ever since the day she found her father's letter. Jason gestured for her to stay silent and moved forward, his movements swift and purposeful. Ella followed, trying to keep her breathing steady, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. They reached a corner of the warehouse, and Jason signaled for her to stop. From their vantage point, they could see a figure standing near a large metal desk. The man in the photo. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and his back was turned to them. He was talking to someone, but Ella couldn't make out the words. Jason's grip tightened on his gun as he leaned closer to Ella. "This is it," he whispered. "This is the man we've been looking for. He's the one who's been following us." Ella's heart pounded in her chest. This was the moment. The man who had been hunting her father's secrets, the man who had been following her every move, was right in front of her. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but now that it was happening, all she could feel was a cold, empty void. Before she could react, the man turned around. Their eyes locked. Jason moved in an instant, drawing his gun and aiming it at the man, his voice steady but commanding. "Don't move. We need answers." The man's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch or react the way most people would. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent chills down Ella's spine. "You've been following me, haven't you?" the man said, his voice low and smooth. "You think you're in control now, but you're not. It's too late." Jason's eyes narrowed. "You know who we are. You know what we've been looking for. So tell us what you know about my father." The man's smile only grew wider. "Your father was a fool. He thought he could escape. But the past has a way of catching up with you. And now, you two are in deeper than you realize." Ella's breath caught in her throat. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. The man chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. "You've come all this way for the truth. But some truths are better left buried." Before either of them could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. Another figure appeared, stepping into the dim light. It was a woman. Her face was partially obscured by a hood, but there was something eerily familiar about her. Ella's blood ran cold as recognition hit her like a slap in the face. The woman's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. "Hello, Ella," the woman said, her voice eerily calm. "I think it's time we had a little talk." Ella's mind reeled, the room spinning as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The woman's face was hauntingly familiar, like someone she had seen in her father's photographs, someone she had never known but who had been lurking in the shadows of her life for far too long. And now, the truth was closer than ever before. But what would it cost to uncover it? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?